All right, picture this. Betty needs to tell Fred and Barney she's coming to town tomorrow. Easy, right?
Sure, sounds simple enough.
She could send 2 separate emails, same info, boom, done.
Right?
But what if instead of 2 emails, she sends 1 to both of them?
Ah, okay, I see where you're going with this.
It's subtle, but now Fred and Barney don't just know Betty's coming. They know that the other one knows.
Yeah, there's a difference there, a kind of shared awareness.
Exactly. And that's the starting point for our deep dive today, this idea of common ground. It's something philosophers have been wrestling with for a while, and it turns out to be way more interesting than you might think.
It really is. It's like this hidden foundation that underpins pretty much all of our communication and interaction.
And for our listeners, who I know are all about getting to the good stuff without getting bogged down, we've done the digging. We've gone deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is like a treasure trove of deep thinking on this topic.
A great resource.
And our mission today is to understand what philosophers mean by common ground, why it matters so much, and maybe touch on some of the, well, the downright strange ways they've tried to explain it.
And it gets pretty strange, that's for sure.
All right, so first things first, what exactly is this common ground?
Well, one of the most influential definitions comes from the philosopher Stalnaker. He said it's a body of information that is presumed to be shared by the parties to a discourse.
Okay, discourse, meaning just any kind of conversation or communication.
Yep, exactly. But another philosopher, Clark, put it in even simpler terms, saying it's a sine qua non for everything we do together.
Sine qua non.
It means something that's absolutely essential, can't do without it, like you can't bake a cake without flour.
Got it. So it's more than just you knowing something and I knowing the same thing.
Right. It's not just shared information. It's something that's actively mutually recognized and acknowledged.
Like if we both see a pink marble on a table, until one of us says something about it, it's not really part of our common ground. It's just a shared experience.
Precisely. Now, the term common ground itself was kind of informally introduced by Paul Grice, who's considered one of the founders of Pragmatics, the study of how we use language in context.
Well, yeah, Grice, the guy with all those maxims of conversation.
Exactly. But since then, the idea has kind of taken on a life of its own. And there's been this explosion of different terms for it: shared knowledge, mutual belief, conversational context, you name it.
So if we're reading a philosophy paper and we see one of these terms, it's probably safe to assume it's in the same general ballpark as common ground?
Yeah, for the most part, it's just philosophers being philosophers, loving to argue about the best way to define things.
So how about we dive into some of the specifics? How does common ground actually play out in how we communicate?
Well, one way is that our utterances depend on common ground. It's like we need it for our words to make sense.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Think about pronouns. If I just say, she did it, it's only going to be meaningful if we both know who she is and what it refers to. That shared understanding comes from our common ground.
Right. Without that shared context, it's just a jumble of words.
Exactly. And it goes way beyond pronouns. It's also essential for things like definite descriptions, the tall guy or the red car, understanding fiction, recognizing when someone's lying.
Wow, so much relies on this shared background.
Yeah, it really is the foundation. And that brings us to the other side of the coin: how our linguistic interactions actually change the common ground.
Okay, so we're not just passively drawing on this shared knowledge. We're actively shaping it with every interaction.
Right. A simple example is Barney says to Betty, "I'll feed the cat." No, that doesn't just convey information about Barney's intention. It actually creates a kind of commitment that's part of their shared understanding from that point on.
So by saying it out loud, he's made it part of their common ground.
Exactly. It's no longer just in his head. It's out there, acknowledged, part of their shared reality. And this is true for all sorts of speech acts: making statements, asking questions, giving commands. They all have this power to reshape the common ground.
That brings us to a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's the actual difference between two people just happening to know the same thing versus that knowledge being part of their common ground?
That's the crux of it.
Yeah.
And it leads us to the different philosophical views on how to best understand common ground.
Okay, let's hear them. What are the main contenders?
There are 3 main ones: the container view, the mentalist view, and the normative view.
Okay, let's unpack those. Starting with the container view, what's that all about?
So the container view is kind of like a very simple picture of common ground. Imagine a container like a glass, and it's filled with all the information that's shared by the people involved.
Okay, so like a big pool of shared knowledge.
Exactly. And in the more formal versions of this view, this container is thought of as a set of possible worlds, which are like different ways the world could be.
The possible worlds, like alternate realities.
Kinda, yeah. It's a way for philosophers to talk about different possibilities. So, say Betty and Barney both agree that it won't rain tomorrow.
Okay.
Their common ground in this view would include all the possible worlds where it's dry, but they might not have talked about whether it'll be warm enough to go swimming. So, some of those dry worlds would be warm and some would be cold.
Got it. So their common ground is like a Venn diagram of all the worlds that fit their shared knowledge.
That's a good way to visualize it. Now, according to this view, when someone makes an assertion, like Betty saying, it'll be warm enough for swimming,
Yeah.
it's like they're shrinking the container, they're eliminating all the worlds where it's not warm enough.
So communication is like refining the common ground, making
Yeah.
it more specific.
That's the basic idea. And the goal of this approach is to actually define different types of speech acts, assertions, questions, promises by how they affect the common ground container.
That sounds kind of neat. But I guess it runs into problems.
Yeah, it turns out to be too simplistic to really capture the nuances of language.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it struggles to explain the difference between different kinds of speech acts. Like, if Barney promises to mow the lawn, in this view, it just means eliminating all the worlds where the lawn isn't mowed.
Right.
But that seems pretty much the same as simply stating that the lawn will be mowed.
Yeah, I see the problem.
And to try and patch this up, people who like this view have had to introduce all sorts of extra bells and whistles, like special lists for commands or separate sets of questions under discussion.
So it's like they're building this increasingly complex system to try and make it work.
Yeah, and it starts to feel a bit ad hoc, like they're just adding things on as they go.
Right, not very elegant.
But the biggest issue, and this is key, is that the container view doesn't really distinguish between information that's simply shared and information that's truly common ground.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Remember Betty and Barney both knowing it won't rain. In this view, that shared knowledge is represented by a set of possible worlds where it's dry. But that same set of worlds could also represent their common ground about the dryness. There's nothing in the container itself that tells us if this is just something they both happen to believe or if it's something they've mutually acknowledged and are taking into account in their interaction.
Ah, I see. So it misses that crucial element of mutual awareness.
Exactly. It's too focused on the information itself and not enough on the interaction and the mental states of the people involved.
Okay, so the container view is kind of a dead end.
Well, it's a starting point, but it definitely has its limitations. So let's move on to the mentalist view. This one gets a bit more into the psychology of things.
All right, bring on the mental gymnastics. What's the mentalist take on common ground?
The mentalist view, as you might guess, focuses on the mental states of the people communicating.
Like their beliefs, desires, intentions, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It sees communication as a way of essentially sharing or influencing these mental states.
So if I say the cat is on the mat, I'm not just conveying information about the cat. I'm also expressing my belief that the cat is on the mat and hoping that you'll come to share that belief.
Precisely. And common ground, in this view, is built from these shared mental states, particularly what we mutually believe.
And this is where we get into that whole I believe that you believe that I believe
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah, the classic idea of mutual belief, it's like a recursive structure. I believe P, you believe P, I believe that you believe P, and so on.
And there's a shorthand for talking about these different levels of belief.
Right. We can use belief with a little subscribed in. So belief sub 1 just means everyone believes P, belief sub 2 means everyone believes that everyone believes P, and so on.
So some philosophers have argued that this mutual belief, this common ground, goes on infinitely, like an endless chain of beliefs about beliefs.
Yep, that's one view. But it's pretty controversial. A lot of people think it's more likely that it goes up a few levels, but not forever.
I mean, that seems more realistic, right? Our brains can only handle so much.
Yeah, the idea of having infinitely many beliefs about a single thing is a bit much.
So how does an utterance, like Wilma saying to Betty, Fred snores, change the common ground in this mentalist view?
So in this view, when Wilma says that, she's expressing her belief that Fred snores, and she's also intending for Betty to adopt that belief.
Assuming Betty trusts Wilma and thinks she's being sincere.
Right, that's a key part of it. They already have some level of common ground, some shared assumptions about each other's trustworthiness. So the utterance doesn't directly change the common ground. It's more like it triggers a change in Betty's mental state, which then contributes to the common ground between them.
Okay, so it's a more indirect effect than in the container view.
Exactly. And this highlights another difference. The mentalist view doesn't define speech acts by their direct effect on the common ground. It's more about the mental states involved.
Interesting. Now, you said that belief isn't the only mental state that philosophers have proposed as the basis for common ground. What are some others?
Well, one is knowledge. Some philosophers, like Clark and Marshall, have argued that common ground is actually mutual knowledge.
But wouldn't that mean we could never have common ground about something that's false?
Yeah, that's the problem. Knowledge is factive, meaning if you know something, it has to be true.
Right.
So if common ground was based on knowledge, we couldn't have common ground about, say, the idea that Napoleon was Greek.
Okay, makes sense. What about other alternatives?
Well, Stalnaker, who we mentioned before, suggested that it's actually mutual acceptance, not belief, that constitutes common ground.
Acceptance.
Yeah, like treating something as true, even if you don't fully believe it yourself.
So, like, if we're having a debate about a scientific theory, we might accept certain assumptions for the sake of the argument.
Exactly. But he also said that in most everyday conversations, acceptance pretty much defaults to belief.
Okay, so it's a more flexible concept that can accommodate different levels of certainty.
Right. But even this idea of mutual acceptance runs into some snags. Stalnaker himself pointed out a kind of logical puzzle with it.
Oh, okay.
He suggested that there could be cases where something is mutually believed but not part of the common ground. Like imagine someone trying to bribe someone else, but they do it in this subtle way where it's mutually understood but never explicitly acknowledged.
Okay, I can see how that would be tricky.
The problem is that if common ground is mutual acceptance and mutual belief implies mutual acceptance, then this scenario creates a contradiction.
Ah, so the definitions clash in a weird way?
It's a bit of a philosophical head-scratcher, but it shows how slippery these concepts can be.
All right, so we've got these different mental states, belief, knowledge, acceptance, but there's also this idea of unbounded common ground, right? This potentially infinite chain of, I believe that you believe that I believe.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's been a source of a lot of debate.
I mean, does anyone really think our brains work that way? Keeping track of an infinite number of beliefs.
It does seem a bit implausible, doesn't it?
So, what are the arguments for this idea of unbounded common ground? Why would anyone think it's necessary?
Well, one line of argument comes from these everyday examples. Like, remember Fred telling Wilma about the beer in the fridge?
Yeah.
The idea is that not only do they come to believe there's beer in the fridge, but they can also reason about each other's reasoning, potentially leading to this endless chain of beliefs about beliefs.
Okay, I can see how that logic works, but just because we can reason that way doesn't mean we actually do, right?
That's the counter-argument. Just because we have the capacity for infinite recursion doesn't mean we're constantly engaging in it.
Right. It's like, I could theoretically trace my family tree back thousands of years, but I don't walk around with that knowledge constantly active in my mind.
Exactly. So the mere possibility of infinite recursion doesn't necessarily mean it's actually happening in our minds.
So what about other arguments for unbounded common ground? You mentioned something about possible worlds.
Yeah, so in this approach, belief is modeled using these things called doxastic worlds. Think of them like different versions of reality that are consistent with what someone believes.
Okay, so like my doxastic world includes all the things I think are true.
Right, and mutual belief in this framework is like a merging of these individual doxastic worlds. What's interesting is that even a relatively small, finite model of these interconnected worlds can actually represent an infinite number of beliefs about beliefs.
Wait, a finite model representing infinite beliefs? How does that work?
It's a bit mind-bending, but essentially, the way these worlds are connected to each other allows for this kind of recursive structure. Like, if Fred believes P, and his doxastic world where P is true is connected back to the original world, that connection can represent him believing that he believes P, and so on, infinitely.
Okay, I'm going to need a diagram for that one. But you also said there are problems with using this kind of logic to model actual belief, right?
Yeah, there are some big ones. One is the principle of closure under entailment. This says that if you believe something, you must also automatically believe everything that logically follows from it.
But that doesn't seem right, does it? I mean, I might believe some basic things about math, but that doesn't mean I suddenly believe all the complex theorems.
Exactly. It would mean that anyone who believes anything at all would also have to believe every true mathematical statement, which is clearly not how our minds work.
Right.
And another principle, called stacking, suggests that believing something implies believing that you believe it, and believing that you believe it, and so on.
So just believing that the sky is blue would lead to this infinite chain of beliefs about the belief itself.
Yeah, and that doesn't seem very plausible either. So while these logical models are interesting, they probably don't accurately reflect the messiness of human cognition.
Okay, so the arguments for unbounded common ground, both from everyday examples and from logic, are a bit shaky. What about the arguments against it? Why are some philosophers skeptical?
One common argument was that unbounded common ground would create these fatal processing issues. Like,
Yeah.
how could we possibly track and update an infinite number of beliefs in real-time conversations?
Yeah, that seems like a lot of mental overhead.
But that argument has kind of weakened because, as we saw, it is possible to have concise representations of infinite mutual belief.
Right, those logical models, even if they're not perfect, show that it's at least theoretically possible.
Exactly. So the more pressing concern now is an ontological one. If common ground is truly unbounded mutual belief, then we'd have to actually have an infinite number of distinct beliefs in our minds.
And that seems like a lot to ask of our limited brains.
Yeah, it stretches the idea of belief pretty thin. And the very nature of belief is something philosophers are still debating, so it's not even clear what it would mean to have infinitely many.
Right. Are they mental representations, physical states in the brain,
Yeah,
something else entirely?
exactly. And depending on what you think beliefs are, the idea of having infinitely many becomes more or less problematic. One philosopher, Schiffer, tried to address this by suggesting that most of our mutual knowledge is implicit, meaning we're not consciously aware of it.
So, like, I might implicitly know the rules of grammar without being able to articulate them.
Right. But even then, the criticism is that we can't just effortlessly infer any arbitrary level of belief from the initial few. Like knowing that your neighbor doesn't own a pet dragon is one thing, but being able to immediately say, I know that I know 76 times over that my neighbor doesn't own a pet dragon is a bit much.
Yeah, that's getting pretty ridiculous.
So, the general consensus seems to be that the mentalist view is plausible if we assume common ground is bounded, meaning it goes up a few levels, but not infinitely.
Okay, so our mental common ground probably isn't an endless hall of mirrors.
Right. It's more like a small room with a few reflections.
All right, that brings us to the third major view, the normative view. This one shifts the focus away from mental states, right?
Exactly. Instead of beliefs, desires, and intentions, normative views focus on things like rules, obligations, and entitlements.
So it's about what we should do or what we're allowed to do rather than what we're actually thinking.
Precisely. And interestingly, these views can often accommodate the idea of unbounded common ground without running into the same problems as the mentalist view.
Okay, let's dive into some examples. You mentioned Lewis's idea of common knowledge, which you said is actually more about reasons to believe.
Right. So Lewis proposed that something is common knowledge, or what we're calling common ground, if everyone has a reason to believe it, and everyone has a reason to believe that everyone has a reason to believe it, and so on, for all levels.
So it's unbounded, but instead of actual beliefs, it's about these reasons to believe.
Exactly. And reason to believe is a normative concept. It means you're entitled to believe something, or maybe even that you should believe it, given the evidence or the situation.
And that's different from actually holding the belief.
Right. You might have a reason to believe something, but not actually believe it yet. Or you might believe something without having a good reason for it.
Okay, so it's about justification rather than just the belief itself.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that those logical principles that were problematic for belief closure under entailment and stacking seem much more plausible when applied to reasons to believe.
So, like, if I have a reason to believe something, it makes sense that I would also have a reason to believe everything that follows from it.
Right. And it also makes sense that I would have a reason to believe that I have a reason to believe it.
So Lewis manages to have this idea of unbounded common ground without requiring us to have infinitely many beliefs rattling around in our heads.
Precisely. And he even connects it back to mental states by saying that these reasons to believe can guide our actual belief formation, but only up to a certain point because of our cognitive limitations.
So we might have infinite reasons to believe something, but we only end up forming the first few levels of actual belief.
Exactly. It's a neat way to bridge the gap between the ideal and the actual.
Now, what about that other normative view you mentioned? The one based on commitments.
This view is even more social in its focus. It sees common ground as being constituted by the relationships we create through communication, specifically our commitments and responsibilities to each other.
So it's not just about what's going on in our heads, but about how we're connected to each other.
Right, and the central idea is that the primary function of language is to establish and maintain these kinds of normative statuses.
And the classic example here is promising, right?
Exactly. When I promise you something, I'm not just expressing an intention, I'm creating a commitment, an obligation to you.
And that commitment is inherently social. It's about the relationship between us.
Precisely. Now, this view uses a specific notation for commitments. A commitment from X to Y about proposition P is written as 6 sic P.
Okay, so if Fred commits to Barney that he saw a squirrel, that would be see Fred Barney saw a squirrel.
You got it. And the idea of shared commitment, which is central to this view, is represented by both 6IP and 6P, meaning both people are committed to each other about the truth of P.
So shared commitment already has that mutual awareness built in. It's not just two separate commitments happening to coincide.
Exactly. And then there's this additional concept of acceptance of a commitment. This is where Y acknowledges that X has made a commitment to them.
So it's like, I can't really promise you something if you don't even acknowledge that I've made the promise.
Right. And the key principle in this view is called simply acceptance. It says that if X has a commitment to Y about P, then Y accepts that X has that commitment.
Okay, so it's like a basic rule of how commitments work. You can't have a one-sided commitment.
Precisely. Now, this seemingly simple principle actually leads to the possibility of unbounded common ground.
How so?
Because if you have a commitment, that implies the other person accepts your commitment. And that acceptance can itself be seen as a kind of commitment, which then implies acceptance of that commitment and so on, potentially ad infinitum.
So it's commitments all the way down.
Kinda, yeah. And there are formal proofs showing that shared commitment is equivalent to mutual commitment, and that having a commitment implies a mutual commitment to having that commitment. It's all driven by this acceptance principle.
So unlike the belief-based views where common ground is kind of separate from individual beliefs, in this view, common ground is tightly intertwined with individual commitments.
Exactly. You can't have one without the other. And just like with Lewis's reasons to believe, this allows for the possibility of unbounded common ground without requiring us to have infinitely many mental states.
Right, so we've got these three main views: the container view, the mentalist view, and the normative view. They all seem to capture something about how we use common ground, but they also have their limitations.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, and there's no single view that perfectly explains everything.
Is it possible that they're all kind of right in their own way? Like maybe we need all three perspectives to fully understand common ground.
That's what some philosophers who take an inclusive view argue. The idea is that these views aren't necessarily competing, but rather complementary.
Okay, so like different pieces of the same puzzle.
Exactly. Lewis, for example, connected reasons to believe and actual beliefs through the idea of individual rationality.
Meaning, if we're rational, our beliefs should be guided by our reasons to believe.
Right. The connection between commitments and beliefs is a bit more complex, though, because commitments are inherently social and have a different kind of normativity.
You also mentioned that our everyday notion of belief might be broader than the more technical philosophical definition.
Yeah, in everyday language, we say we believe all sorts of things. Facts, opinions, even moral principles. And commitments seem to align more with this broader notion. They're not just about narrow factual truth.
So how do belief and commitment relate to each other in this inclusive view?
Well, just believing something doesn't automatically mean you're committed to it. And sharing a belief doesn't necessarily imply a shared commitment.
Okay, so those are distinct things.
But if we have a mutual belief about something, it often seems to imply a mutual commitment to acting as if that belief is true, at least in that context.
Right, like if we both believe it's going to rain, we're both likely to bring umbrellas.
Exactly. And similarly, if we make a commitment, it usually implies that we also believe we can fulfill it within the bounds of practicality.
So while belief and commitment are different, they tend to go hand in hand.
Yeah, especially in everyday situations.
This whole conversation has been about these ideal cases, two people talking face to face. But what happens when we move away from that? Like, what about communicating with large groups or when we don't know who we're talking to, or when there are big gaps in time?
That's where things get really interesting because common ground is definitely trickier in those situations.
And the level of acquaintance, meaning how well we know each other, seems to play a big role, right?
Absolutely. One way to think about this is through the distinction between de re and de dicto beliefs.
De re and de dicto.
Yeah, it's a bit jargony, but basically, a dairy belief is about a specific individual or object that you have some kind of direct acquaintance with.
Okay, so my belief that Betty is wearing a blue shirt
Hmm.
is de re, because I know Betty and I can see her wearing the shirt.
Exactly. But a de dicto belief is about whoever or whatever fits a certain description.
So if I read a news article about a politician I've never met, my belief that the politician is corrupt is de dicto.
Precisely. And as we move away from face-to-face interaction, our beliefs and our common ground become more de dicto and less de re.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does just having a bigger audience change the common ground?
Well, for one thing, it's less likely that everyone in the audience knows each other, so there's less shared background knowledge you can assume. It also becomes harder for the speaker to judge what they can safely take as common ground. And even the very idea of audience becomes more diffuse.
Right, it's not a clearly defined group anymore.
Exactly.
What about situations where there's complete anonymity, like sending a message in a bottle or reading an anonymous blog post?
Anonymity really pushes common ground to its limits. In those cases, it's mostly de dicto, and it becomes questionable whether there's any substantial common ground at all.
I see what you mean. If I'm reading an anonymous pamphlet, I don't really know anything about the author, so what shared understanding can we even have?
Right, it becomes very difficult to establish any kind of mutual belief or shared commitment.
And what about communication across large time gaps? Like reading something written centuries ago. Is there really common ground between me and, say, Plato?
It's a stretch. I mean, we can certainly learn about Plato's beliefs, and there's a shared historical and intellectual context. But the kind of immediate mutual understanding that we have in face-to-face conversations is largely absent.
And the lack of interactivity must also play a role, right? In a conversation, we can constantly clarify things and make adjustments based on each other's responses.
Absolutely. Clark and Wilkes-Gibbs did this famous experiment where they had people try to describe shapes to each other, and they found that even simple acts of referring require a lot of back and forth negotiation. That kind of dynamic collaboration is missing in these more one-sided forms of communication.
So the big takeaway here is that as we move away from face-to-face interaction, common ground becomes less certain, less rich, and in some cases might not even exist in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's the general trend. And it raises some really interesting questions about the limits of communication.
Like if we think about that anonymous pamphlet example again, even if there's no real common ground, we can still read it and understand what the author's trying to say.
That's the surprising thing. It suggests that communication can happen even without this strong foundation of pre-existing shared understanding.
So what's going on there? If common ground isn't doing the work, what is?
That's a great question. And it points to the idea that there must be other mechanisms at play, other ways we make sense of each other's words that go beyond just relying on what we already share.
I mean, think about that classic example. Pedro owns a donkey. He beats it. We can understand that sentence perfectly fine, even if we know absolutely nothing about Pedro or his donkey.
Exactly. So how do we do that? What are those basic building blocks of meaning that allow us to understand each other even in the absence of common ground? That's a huge question in philosophy of language, and one that goes beyond just the concept of common ground.
Wow, so much to think about. We've really gone deep down the rabbit hole with this one.
We have from the basic definition of common ground to the intricacies of different philosophical views to these fascinating cases where it seems to break down.
And it's totally fine if this feels like a lot to take in. It's a complex topic, and there's still a lot of debate going on.
Absolutely. But hopefully our listeners have gained some insights into this hidden layer of communication that we all rely on, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
And maybe it'll make you pay attention to your own conversations in a new way. Think about the assumptions you're making, the shared understandings you're relying on.
And if you're feeling adventurous, maybe even dive into the work of some of the philosophers we've mentioned, Grice, Stalnaker, Lewis. There's a whole world of fascinating ideas out there.
And to leave you with a final thought, if we can communicate effectively, even without this strong foundation of common ground, what does that tell us about the very nature of language and meaning? What are those fundamental mechanisms that make it all work? That's something to ponder until our next deep dive.